The start of the Second Crusade can be identified by several key events that most of all included the fall of a city taken during the First Crusade, and the passing away of the generation of the First Crusade warriors. Such an event occurred in 1144 AD when Edessa fell to Emir Zengi. The next year, in 1145 AD, the Pope Eugenius III issued the Papal Bull Quantum Praedecessores, highlighting the First Crusade, and calling on the Knights of the West to hopefully imitate the results of the First Crusade. Since Louis VII of France had already been in touch with leadership in the Eastern Empire and was preparing his own crusade, the Pope implored Louis to go along with the papal sanction, presumably believing that a strong leader taking up the cross would compel others to do so. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux became the voice of the call to the Second Crusade. The most popular public speaker of his day, he made speeches all over Europe inspiring men to the cross. It was said, quote, "The eloquence of Saint Bernard sent whole communities in motion. The appeal was heeded by kings and princes." End quote. In light of councils that occurred in the run-up to the Second Crusade, one might have seen another violent escapade as hypocrisy, or a setback in the progress of the Church toward claiming her role as spiritual leader and not temporal. Saint Bernard himself assisted by offering a lofty oratory on the Church's power to command secular power. Bernard wrote, quote, "To Pope Eugenius III that the Church has both swords," end quote. Thomas Aquinas picked up on Bernard's theme. Quote, "We should say that the Church has the spiritual sword only regarding things which it can accomplish by itself. But the Church, in addition, has the temporal sword regarding what it can command, since the temporal sword should be unleashed at the Church's bidding, as Bernard says." End quote. Far from wanton imperialism, Clairvaux's beliefs demonstrate clearly the beliefs of many Europeans of his time toward crusading. In reality, one sees a divided church with a more pacifistic side wanting to remain altogether from temporal affairs, and another wanting to control all they possibly could under the premise that the Church of God's institution can make life better for believers and should not be limited by any means in her endeavors. Louis VII of France agreed with the Church and was the first to answer the call to take up the cross. He gathered his nobles and raised a French contingent. Conrad III of Germany was said to have cried when he heard Bernard's speech. He gathered his crusader force from among Boleslaw IV the Curly and Vladislaus II of Bohemia, as well as his nephew who would become the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick of Swabia, whose circuitous route to the Holy Land made his Second Crusade experience quite different than that of Conrad and Louis. The Pope's plea also called for crusades in Al-Andalus, but expressed a quite different call about that mission. Instead of traveling from Spain to Outremer, he instead encouraged those able to fight to look to their own situations. Meanwhile, Alfonso I, who by this time had carved out a new country from the Iberian mainland called Portugal, felt he had gained the strength necessary to take on the Muslim city of Lisbon. Alfonso was strong and energetic from a lifetime of battle against the Moors, but had also gained skill as a diplomat. He was well equipped for such a campaign and took a small town just outside the major metropolis on his way to besiege Lisbon. He then began in earnest to settle in for a long winter. Crusaders of Flemish, Norman, and German ethnicity joined him as well. They were initially passing through as they made their way to the Holy Land, but by Alfonso's encouragement stayed to fight his crusade in return for their share of the booty. The siege of Lisbon was effective to slowly but steadily bring the city under the control of Alfonso and his crusaders. When individual Moors reached the point where they could no longer hold out for want of food, and if they thought they could do so without risking their lives, many turned themselves over to the crusaders. Ironically, hunger seems to be of greatest account in this battle. The Muslims holding out at Lisbon eventually caved to the pressure of the Crusaders and the city fell. There was no hope for Lisbon from the start because the surrounding Moorish principalities refused to break the treaties they had recently made with Alfonso, agreeing to come to the aid of their fellows over ethnic and religious ties. Meanwhile, Louis VII and Conrad III marched east and in 1147 AD arrived at Constantinople. Conrad was the first to arrive in the region and went into the field instead of waiting for Louis VII to arrive. He followed in the footsteps of the first-generation Crusaders and met a Turkish army at Dorylaeum, where Bohemond of Taranto and the first Crusaders had crushed Kili Arslan about a half-century earlier. This time, though, the Turks were victorious and forced Conrad into retreat. After losing much of his force, he was left with no choice but to trickle back toward Nicaea and await the French. When Louis VII arrived in Nicaea, he was greatly concerned over how decimated the German force had become. The two forces decided to forge new ground through Syria, which proved to be another debacle. Their plan fell far short of the military acumen demonstrated by their predecessors. This time, Crusaders fell under constant attack from Turks, which caused fear and killed morale among the Crusaders. There was, however, one great success to speak of when on Christmas that year, they pushed the Turks back out of Ephesus and reclaimed it for the Christians, as well as winning a battle at Meander Ford. When the Crusaders moved on from their victory to cross the mountains into Antioch, the king decided it would be safer to enlist Italian shipping to move his army. As it would turn out, there were not near enough ships to move all his men. Instead of leading the remnant of his force overland, Louis decided to join his family and head south by ship, leaving his forces to go overland alone, which may or may not have been standard for monarchs. Thankfully, the Knights Templar and Outremer were able to travel with them, and that protected the Franks from what would have been much harsher results from hit-and-run tactics by the Turks. Once again, the lack of stability and security among the Muslim leaders themselves proved to bode well for the Crusaders. Nur ad-Din took over for his father Emir Zengi in Aleppo when a Frankish prisoner stabbed Zengi to death in his bath. Perhaps to set the tone for the Europeans in the region, perhaps just because it's how it was in the Muslim world for one to establish his authority, one of Nur ad-Din's first acts was to order the slaughter of every man, woman, and child in Edessa. Then he burned the city to the ground so the Crusaders could not retake it. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, was eager to participate in the crusade by putting up the French army and supporting them in the field. His excitement turned to surprise, then great worry when, instead of a strong force, demoralized remnants of the French infantry trickled into the city without their leader, who he watched arrive separately with his entourage. Raymond was still poised to work with what he had, and thought an attack on Aleppo could be successful with the resources they had mustered. Raymond's thinking factored in the reality that, at least in his mind, Crusaders could exploit the infighting between Emir Zengi's heirs. The dispute between Saif ad-Din and Nur ad-Din had resulted in Nur controlling the Syrian city of Aleppo and Saif controlling Mosul in Iraq. Raymond's suggestion was overlooked, though, when Louis VII noticed the gathering of more Crusader forces south between Jerusalem and Ashkelon. Acre, one of the cities still under firmly Christian control, was where council of war was convened in June 1148 AD to decide on the next steps. For any who have looked through the revisionist lens to suggest that the siege on Damascus was a thrown-together affair, need only look at those in attendance in Acre on June 24th to realize otherwise. It was decided after a great deal of debate that with the resources they had on hand, an attack on Damascus could be successful after all, if the element of surprise belonged to them, and the split between the Zengi heirs was in reality as they had been told. The Crusaders thought that with the political infighting between the ad-Din brothers that perhaps they could exploit the unrest in Damascus and walk right into the town with minimal opposition, as had happened a surprising number of times elsewhere on both sides. Also, a treaty between Jerusalem and Damascus had reached its end, or was near reaching its end. Neither side would want to guess what would happen when their treaty expired. If the projected variables panned out, Damascus was a much better option for Crusade at the time than attempting to descend on Aleppo. Immediately they began mustering for a crusade on Damascus. Conrad III and Louis VII, the Templar Knights, and the army from Jerusalem prepared and marched on Damascus. They laid siege to the city, but did not find conditions as they expected to find them. Morale among the Damascenes was strong. Moreover, they found out that Nur ad-Din and his brother had settled a temporary truce, and Saif was coming with his army from Mosul. The Christians were left with no choice but to abandon their siege after just 4 days. In reality, they probably prevented a slaughter, because now Saif ad-Din could not only strengthen Damascus, but force the Crusaders into a two-front battle against Damascus and his army in the open field. The crusade virtually ended at that point, and the Crusaders mostly went home. Jerusalem's only choice at that moment was to renew the peace treaty with Damascus, something they were lucky to accomplish considering their act of open aggression against the ad-Dins. Finally, there is the question of Byzantine Christian support in the Second Crusade. Certainly an alliance would have helped and could perhaps have led to the fall of Damascus, had the Byzantines under their new Comnenus Emperor Manuel offered help. However, it could have been in the best interest of the Eastern Empire to have stability from Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and Jerusalem at the time. That is not to suggest that the Greeks didn't participate at all. One source noted minor involvement and indicated, quote, "At Ephesus, an army encountered Greek messengers, warning them of Turkish attack if they advanced further, causing Louis VII to seek shelter in Byzantine fortresses for the winter." While well-meant and accurate, such intelligence hardly compensated for what later struck some Crusade veterans, as Manuel's very cynical policy had failed to provide an adequate flow of provisions or a large enough shadowing fleet to succor or transport the Western host, even if impotent against the Turkish incursions. Also failed to get Greeks to show hospitality or openness to Eastern markets. While not wishing the Crusaders ill, he no longer needed to appease or cater to their interests. End quote. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time when we get into the period before the Third Crusade, the Battle of Hattin, and we finally meet Saladin. Talk to you next time.